Our interviewer is Peter Overby. Many of you know him, well, know his voice probably. You've heard it on the radio many times on NPR News. He's NPR's correspondent covering campaign finance and lobbying, and he allegedly totes around a business card that I haven't gotten yet that says Power, Money, and Influence Correspondent. I'm going to get one. I can frame it. Peter's been awarded a Alfred DuPont Columbia Silver Baton for his reporting coverage. Here it is. It does say that. Nice and paper-saving card. Thank you, Peter. Our panel consists of Joel Gora, professor of law at Brooklyn Law School. He's been a professor there since 1978, teaching constitutional law, civil procedure, and a number of other related courses, and served twice as Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. He's the author of a number of books and articles dealing on First Amendment and other constitutional issues, and he's also an expert on political parties, having co-authored with our other panelist, Peter Wallison, a very interesting book I highly recommend to you called Better Parties, Better Government, a realistic program for campaign finance reform. Neil Reiff here is a founding member of the firm of Sandler, Reiff, and many others in Washington, D.C. Neil has a lot of experience representing particularly state parties and has been very active trying to address many of the problems that these state parties are facing. Of course, he's an expert on campaign finance and election law. And then we also have Peter Wallison, Arthur Burns Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. While he's probably best known for his work on financial policy studies, he's also an expert on political parties as well, and I think will add greatly to this panel. He's also the co-author of the book that I mentioned earlier. So, Peter, we'll turn it over to you for the panel. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for joining me up here. I'd be really lonely otherwise. I thought about bringing like birthday things, little sparklers and hats and stuff.
Party favors?
Yeah. It seemed appropriate somehow, but I don't know, it didn't work out. So we're going to talk about the political parties, what's happened to them in the post-Citizens United world, and they've gotten help recently from McCutcheon and from the omnibus that went through, and is more help needed? So why don't we start with the status quo? What is the situation now with the political parties? What kind of shape are they in?
Well, I'll start. Well, okay. I'm going to give it more of a state and local party perspective.
Okay.
And I'll let you guys fill in on a national level, but I'll at least talk about it from the state and local level. And I actually want to take it back before Citizens United, because the story, or at least for state and local parties, doesn't begin with Citizens United. It actually begins with McCain-Feingold. So where they are today is more, where did Citizens United take parties after McCain-Feingold is more the story than what did Citizens United itself do to parties. Because as a matter of law, Citizens United didn't do anything legally to any party committee. So it's really more about where they were at the time and what effect has it had since. So from my perspective, again, as David said, I focus primarily right now on state and local party committees, the grassroots organizations that are the ones out there touching the voters on a day-to-day basis. McCain-Feingold has done significant damage to those organizations. And I'm here as a Democratic campaign attorney saying these things.
Well, Martin Frost was saying the same thing before it passed.
Yeah, and so are we.
Yeah.
My partner, Joe Sandler, was quoted in the Atlantic Monthly right before the passage of McCain-Feingold and said it was a great, just to get to the right to the point, he called it a fascist monstrosity. He was then the general counsel of the Democratic National Committee. So it's just to show you where we stood on this case. And some of the reform groups were not happy with us at the time.
But the history since then is the Democratic National Party committees have done pretty well.
Well, that's all relative. I'll finish my story and then I'll respond to that. So I just wanted to get to the point of where did it leave state and local party committees? What did McCain-Feingold do to it? McCain-Feingold federalized an organizations that, in my view, primarily focus on state and local elections. Why? Because in the zeal to regulate some practices that were happening at the national level, and I'll be I was, again, Deputy General Counsel of the Democratic National Committee when McCain-Feingold passed. So I'll be the first to admit, yes, there were some things going on in politics and campaign finance at the time that probably deserved some level of regulation. But did they need to go as far as to regulate state and local activity of state and local party committees? So what ended up happening, to make a very long story short, was they divorced from a financial relationship state and local parties' ability to work with state and local candidates. And the big effect of that was that state and local party committees have begun to atrophy because of it. Because state and local candidates do not want to work with the party committees because they're in a federal system and these candidates are in a state system. The campaign finance laws in most states are incompatible between the federal system and the state system. And it's because state parties basically lose influence at the state and local level, and they're losing influence as organizations. Kind of getting back to the national, well, let me talk for 2 seconds about Citizens United, and then I'll talk about national party committees and what role they played in supporting state and local party committee. Citizens United, as I said, did not have a direct effect on parties, but it has exacerbated the problem for state and local party committees because they're already struggling for relevancy in the political system financially. Because of their inability to work in state and local elections with state and local money, they're already fighting for their lives. Now, Citizens United comes along and enhances the relative power of outside groups. So basically, they already had one hand tied behind their back, and now they're getting their second hand tied behind their back. So if you believe in party committees, and I do, and if you believe in strengthening party committees, the structural integrity of the system right now is falling apart because power is shifting. Power is shifting to outside groups. In my view, power needs to be shifted back to party committees. So the way to do that is to empower state and local party committees. And if you ask any Democratic state chair in America, they will wholeheartedly agree with that and will tell you sad stories about their demise because of the way the campaign finance laws are currently structured. And I'll just say one more thing and then I'll pass it on, and not to hog all the time. When I was DNC counsel, the DNC spent a lot of money helping the infrastructure of state and local party committees. A lot of that money came from non-federal funds, compatible with state laws. You cut off that spigot, you cut off the ability of the national party committees to provide significant financial support to the state and local party committees. If you compare the numbers, I don't have any numbers with me today, but if you did a financial analysis of party support before McCain-Feingold and party support after McCain-Feingold, you will find a significant difference. Now, of course, you're going to find money passed in a targeted state in a presidential election. You'll say, well, what about all that money that's going in there for the presidential election? That money is spent before it even gets in the door. It's not there to improve the infrastructure of the party. It's not there to hire staff, to give that party institutional relevance. That's there to pay for the expenses that are pretty much already accounted for. So if you're a red state, if you're a Democratic Party in a red state, for example, look at the numbers of the Kansas Democratic Party, look at the numbers of the Oklahoma Democratic Party. There's no way for the National Party or incentive for them to provide support to those kinds of states. Look at the Connecticut Republican Party. I'm sure these states are all struggling for relevance, and the national parties will not spend federal money to help their infrastructure. It just doesn't happen.
Okay, let me ask you one follow-up question.
Yes.
Before, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The days back when Howard Dean was chairman of the Democratic Party, he had this big thing about he's going to make it a 50-state party again, and everybody thought that was an idiotic idea, or not everybody, but a lot of people did, because he was sending money to states where the Dems were never going to win anyway. What happened with that? Was that a sincere effort?
It was a sincere effort, and I was at the DNC when that happened. It was a big challenge to balance the resources of keeping the doors of the DNC open and putting money into that system and support the state parties. And again, I'm not currently affiliated with the DNC at this time. Yeah. I don't believe, if you compare the numbers when Howard Dean was there and today, I think the support has gone down, empirically, if you did the analysis. Okay. I know that the DNC sends a certain amount of money to state parties every month to finance a staffer, but I'm not sure there's a whole lot more going on than that right now. Okay. It's a great idea, and if the resources were there, even the current DNC, I'm sure, would make it a priority if they could financially. But what happens is, with the limited federal money they have, it's spent on that presidential election, and they spend 3 years just trying to catch up to pay off the debts. And this is a perennial problem. This is not a new problem. But cutting off the access to the non-federal money has made it worse. I know there's a lot to talk about with the new limits too, and perhaps they have some ideas.
On to the national level.
Yes.
Okay. Three quick things. Number one, happy birthday, Citizens United. I said the day it was decided, and I've said ever since, it's one of the greatest First Amendment decisions ever written. It reaffirmed what we helped establish in part in Buckley 35 years earlier, that where political speech is concerned, given the First Amendment, the government has no business controlling political speech in almost any way. That's number one. Happy birthday. Number two, the one negative consequence, which as Anil pointed out, was not a direct result of the decision, didn't speak to it, was that now all of the independent groups, the unions and the nonprofits and the corporations, as well as individuals who had the authority and the power from Buckley forward, could spend without limitation, could raise and spend without limitation on politics, on express advocacy, on the core of political speech. And the only groups who were basically limited were the parties and the candidates, who were still relegated to hard money. So that's the second point. The problem of Citizens United, if you want to call it that, is it gave so much freedom to groups that hadn't had it directly before, but didn't give it to the parties. And then the third point is the parties have done better in terms of raising money within the restrictions. And in the last 6 months, between the McCutcheon case, which made it easier to raise money because donors could give to more party committees and to more party candidates, and the omnibus bill, which tripled the amount of money that people could give to certain party functions, I have to say, we now basically have soft money again. It's highly disclosed. It's limited to, I think the figure is $3 million that a couple can give in a 2-year period to all the different party committees. And this was supported by the Democrats and the Republicans. It seems to me that has set a new baseline for what a proper contribution limit is. And I think the next challenge to the low contribution limits will just cite the fact that Congress thought that $3 million from a couple, or whatever the high end is, was not a corrupting amount of money to give. Wow, I'd take that case even on a contingency. But the final point, this is going to lead to Peter. What our book says is it's great if parties can get more money coming in, which is, I think, now the situation. But the real problem is they're limited in its going out to help their candidates. And the one area of control that Peter and I, that our book advocated against when it was written and has gotten some real currency now, is take the wraps off the ability of the parties to help their candidates, which will not only be good for campaign finance concerns, but we say good for democracy. Don't we, Peter?
We do. Thank you, Joel. The interesting question, I think, is what do we do to supplant independent expenditure? Because independent expenditure is obviously constitutional, should never be impaired in any way, for all the reasons that people have just been talking about. But we have a system in which independent expenditure is now encouraged, as Joel was just suggesting. The issue, it seems to me, is finding a way to make politics better, make our political system better through use of the campaign finance laws. And when Peter said parties are doing pretty well a little while ago, I thought to myself, well, they are, in the sense that they are raising more money. But parties are in one business, and that is to elect candidates. And to elect a candidate, you have to be able to support that candidacy. What we have in the United States today is a system that benefits incumbents. We have to recognize that. The incumbents have all of the advantages, not only the advantages of incumbency itself, that is, you have an office, you have a staff, you have travel back and forth to the district, you have access to all the media you could want in the district, you can mail things to your constituents about what wonderful things you are doing to them and so forth, but also you can establish a war chest over the 2 years or maybe 6 years that you were in office. And so a challenger now coming in to try to beat an incumbent has a huge steep climb to make. Not only does the challenger have to raise money to compete with the incumbent who has already raised money, but the challenger also has to hire a staff and hire a pollster and all the other things that you have to do in order to run a campaign without really basically from a standing start. So if we wanted to have a better system, a system in which challengers could actually challenge incumbents more effectively, how would we do that? And we could do that through political parties. And this is the point of the book. Because political parties are engaged in one thing, and that is to achieve power by electing a majority of their candidates to the Senate, the House, and at every state level. But we are hamstringing our parties in a way that probably most people in the United States and probably most people in this room don't know, and that is that parties can give only tiny amounts of money to their candidates now. It's $5,000 in a House race. Somewhat more can be coordinated with the candidate. A few $1,000s gets up into about $1 million or so in a Senate race is for the coordinated spending, but that's it. Everything else that a candidate uses to get elected, the candidate has to raise himself or herself. Now think about this. We have a system in which we are saying every day, well, it's really terrible that candidates become attached to or controlled by or influenced by all of these influences, all these interests throughout the country. And then we say to the candidates, but you've got to go out and raise money from the very people who are trying to influence you. Does that make any sense? My answer is it makes no sense. If we want to have a system in which candidates are elected based on their abilities and their ability to contact and talk effectively with voters and get voters to see the benefits of what they were doing, what they are or intending to do, we ought to give them a way to actually do that work and compete effectively by allowing the parties to support the candidates who get the nomination. And that would mean allowing the parties to set up separate accounts in which this would be hard money, separate accounts into which contributions could be made, and out of those accounts, they could do everything necessary to support their candidates. And what would be some of the benefits of this? And we can go through them later, maybe, if we have time. But some of the benefits would be that campaigns would be much less costly, because in every campaign, the candidate has to raise the money for his or her own pollster, for example, for the lawyer, for the accountant, for the driver, for all of these other activities have to be raised by the candidate, him or herself. When you think about it, the party could supply those things very easily at much less cost to the candidate. But we're not allowing all those things to happen. So that's one benefit that we would see from allowing the parties to do it. Another would be the parties would form ideas, programs. The candidates would support the party's programs. If the candidate didn't support the party's programs, the candidate might suffer in terms of the amount of money he or she would get from the party. But, of course, there's always independent fundraising the candidate could continue to do if the candidate wanted to remain independent. But most candidates would accept support from the parties, substantial support from the parties, support the party's program. The parties would get elected or unelected based on whether they actually instituted the program that they promised the voters to institute. That would be the way elections should be run. But as we know, today people vote for candidates who cannot possibly do the things they promise because they're only a single person. And they are often very independent of what the parties want to do on various programs. So there's no relationship clearly between voting for a particular candidate and getting the policies that you want once the candidate wins office. So
Sure.
That's the summary of it.
Are you saying that the party would set up a committee to support a separate committee to support each candidate, or there's sort of a general committee that...
General fund,
Okay,
a general fund, which would accept only hard money,
I'm sorry?
which would accept only hard money, and that, whatever that amount is, permitted by law, we're not challenging that. But then that account would be able to spend as much as it wanted for each candidate.
So you're not talking about changing the fundraising side of the party activity, you're changing the
Expenditure.
degree of freedom with which they can spend the money.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Has anyone ever proposed this?
Well, in fact,
Legislatively, sorry.
again, a prop. We didn't invent this idea. It was embraced by 4 justices in the Supreme Court in the Colorado II case, 2001, where the challenge was to the limits on the ability of parties to coordinate hard money spending with their candidates, to support their candidates without limitation. And that was a 5-4 case where the court, a little warm up for the McConnell case a year or 2 later, said, oh, the parties are corrupt too and you can't do it. But 4 justices said it makes great sense, both as a political science matter, to have the parties and the candidates more together, as well as a First Amendment matter, because these limits are pointless. So it's not a wild-eyed idea. It was embraced by 1 vote short of becoming the law, and I have a feeling that the current court might be much more hospitable to taking another look at this.
You have something
I'll make a couple of points about this. I first want to point out that I just read a study that a couple of studies came out about independent spending in the 2014 Senate races in the last couple of weeks. I was very impressed to see that the largest independent expenditure in the aggregate in the United States Senate races in 2014 was the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee.
Yeah.
And that's unbelievable. You are making a party organization, I think the number was $55 million, if I'm remembering it correctly, independently of its candidates. A party organization is being forced. I mean, this buys right into what these guys are saying, which is, why should party committees be forced, and what is the policy justification for forcing them to spend $55 million inefficiently, independently of their candidates?
And
so,
kind of fitting in with that, the biggest super PAC was Senate Majority PAC, the Democratic.
right. Which brings to the next point, which is, so now we have a system, instead of having strong parties working with their candidates, you have 2 perverse other options. One is to put a group of people in a room where they can't talk to the rest of the staff. And I personally managed in 2004, I was the in-house, I was Deputy General Counsel of the DNC. We spent over $120 million on independent expenditures in the presidential election with a group of people who couldn't talk to the staff, who were unaccountable to anybody else within the organization. But yet they managed to come up with 100, because there was so much money raised. This was the first time we were kids in a candy shop. There was so much money available. They could set aside $120 million to spend independently with a group of individuals they had to hire who had no prior relationship. I mean, all 6 national party organizations have this room or have this office where there are people who don't communicate with the rest of the organization. It makes no sense. The second perverse result of everything is, and especially this is at the state and local level, where are the best and brightest of the parties going? They're not going back to the party committees. There was an article in this morning's paper, a former chief of staff of Mitch McConnell. The story was he wasn't going back to the party, he was forming a super PAC. So we're losing there's a huge brain drain at the party level where they are basically bypassing the parties. What's happening at the state and local level, there is now becoming a proliferation of state and local super PACs at the state and local level to replace party committees to do grassroots politics. This was just causing further atrophy of state and local party committees. Because what are they doing? They're working around the fact that McCain-Feingold is causing state parties to only work in a federal way. Whereas after Citizens United, after SpeechNow.org, which is really the case that kind of started the super PAC phenomenon, you can go into a state, form a non-party PAC, and raise money without limit, while the party is sitting there with $10,000 federal limits, not only to play in federal races, but because of McCain-Feingold, to use in state races. The system is just completely out of whack.
Even if there were no First Amendment, it's totally out of whack.
Well, which makes me think of the other side of the campaign finance reform equation, which is the anti-corruption rationale. you say that the omnibus bill sets a new, may set a new threshold for what's considered corrupting. Is this something that Congress needs to bite into? Do they need to start grappling with this?
Well, they did it eyes open. They knew what they were doing, and it made perfectly good sense.
They did it. It was not a fully debated legislative process.
Right,
Let's put it that way.
I understand.
Yeah.
But I think, in a way, starting with Citizens United, the court has made it clear that the notion that underlay McCain-Feingold's restriction on parties, that if you're a financial supporter of a party and that gets you an invitation to a reception or a gathering where you meet elected officials and have a chance to talk to them, McCain-Feingold basically said that's the kind of corruption that Congress can properly worry about. Citizens United happily said, no, it's not. Because the argument, remember, was that independent spenders and corporations and unions and all would curry influence with the politicians they supported and helped. And the court's answer to that was that's not corruption. In fact, that may even be the heart of democracy. If you support a candidate because of their views and policies in any one of a number of ways, and then as a result they embrace you and support those policies, that kind of receptiveness and responsiveness is not corrupting. It's the democratic process. So I think the court's attitude toward what might happen if people who give money to parties and all get closer access to the politicians that are affiliated with parties has changed sufficiently that there would not be the same concern.
Okay, taking just one more step down this path. People generally think that Washington is totally corrupt now.
Right.
So, you know, is that something that the Congress wants to do, or does it need to be more attentive to what public perception is of how our government works?
Well, I mean, public perception is a pretty malleable thing. And we were talking before the meeting program about if you get your information about all of this from certain sources, I won't name names, then your perception is that any spending on politics is corrupt. I mean, I think, and I've said this in print, in an article in the Cato Supreme Court Review about the Arizona public financing case, I said if you look at that 5-4 decision, the dissenters, there's a sense that the dissenters in the Supreme Court feel that almost any private funding is corrupt. That unless the government is in charge of the funding of politics, it's always going to be corrupt. There's a potential danger anywhere. So, I mean, I think if corruption is going to be that kind of a standard, then it just gives the government the power to do anything.
Well,
Let me break in if I can, Peter, because
Sorry?
I'd like to mention something on just this point, on the corruption point, and that is that we have a choice, really, here about what kind of financial system we use for campaigns. The system we have today does not prevent corruption, and everyone recognizes that, and that is the candidate has to go out and has to raise money from the people who are trying to influence that candidate. On the other hand, we know that the system that we have today is a system that supports incumbents. So a public system that is campaign finance by the government, for example, which is supported by many, many people, you hear it a lot, especially on the left, is also a bad idea because incumbents do structure the laws so that they benefit them. And at state levels, we've seen this happen a lot, when the Supreme Court has gratefully struck these things down, but efforts to keep spending down and other things that make it much more difficult for challengers have been stopped. So we have a choice, and that is, are we going to deal with the corruption issue through leaving the current system in place and penalizing the parties, or are we going to put the parties in the middle and say, one way we can diffuse the issue of corruption is to make the contributions go to the parties, because that does diffuse it. You're not specifically influencing a person. You are maybe influencing a party, but it's much harder to do because the party's interest is for a much broader policy for the country as a whole.
okay. Yeah, that's as far down that road as I want to go, I think. because we're talking about parties. If the parties are in this terrible condition right now, is there anything short of legislation that can be done nationally to deal with it?
Well, there are a couple of, and this is going to, if to really answer this question, I have to really get into the weeds of campaign finance law, and I don't want to do that. But I have to give some credit to the Federal Election Commission, actually, because back this past summer, they actually held a listening hearing about party committees and gave the National and Republican Party lawyers, including myself, to spend time to discuss what the FEC could do to fix the rules. And there are a few things the FEC could do, and we discussed that. But the bottom line is that most of the problems and the structural problems that need to be fixed can only be fixed through legislation. There's not a whole lot you can do administratively. The FEC itself, I think after McCain-Feingold wrote some very reasonable regulations that tried to balance the intent of the law and the speech of parties. The FEC was sued 3 times by the reform groups after promulgating what I believe were very reasonable regulations. And that is in part of the problem, because the FEC has been forced to further and further federalize non-federal activity by party committees and organizations by having to continually redefine what it means to act in connection with federal elections. So I think the FEC should take another look at that. I think the courts need to take another look at that. But the primary way to respond to this is legislation.
Well, I guess I would reiterate the possibility of a constitutional challenge to the existing limits that Peter was identifying and Neil was identifying on the existing statutory limits on the ability of parties to help their candidates. And given the case law, the recent case law and the court's approach, I think such a challenge would have a decent chance of.
And also, the Republican National Committee has filed in the last few years 2 different lawsuits. One was challenging the coordinated expenditure limits again. This was a Louisiana case. And they actually tried to challenge McCain-Feingold, and they were unsuccessful in both cases.
Right.
So we're just waiting for that next case to get to the Supreme Court. Clearly, if McConnell versus FEC came before this Supreme Court, I think we all agree there would have been a different result. Mm-hmm. But we have what we have, and the court was what it was in 2003.
Okay. If things don't change, where are we headed? One of the things that has struck me over the past couple cycles is that at least from my perspective, and I think that of some other people, the Koch organization is starting to look more and more like a political party in its structure. And is that where we're headed, toward essentially privatized political parties? Or what happens now?
Well, this is part of the phenomenon that we've been sort of bemoaning here.
Yeah,
that,
but where do you end up?
Well, I think you end up by going back to first principles and saying, isn't it better to have the parties, the kind of broad, inclusive national parties, be the primary spokesman for policy debates than have the other groups?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if it doesn't get fixed, what happens?
If it doesn't get fixed, then I think what we say is we got a lot of voices out there, and that's a wonderful thing. And what we have to do is try to amplify the party voices more. I mean, they still, if you look at the overall figures, the parties still spend considerably more in congressional elections overall than the independent groups do. Candidates spend the most, parties next, independent groups. So there's a kind of a balance there. The parties are still more predominant. But the problem is, the more that we allow the limits on parties to fester, the more the other kinds of groups are going to try to become parties. Mm-hmm. And they'll do it in a way that will skirt the limitations that parties have. That doesn't make any sense as a political science matter. It certainly makes no sense as a First Amendment matter. And one of the core principles of Citizens United is there are no second-class speakers in the First Amendment. That everybody wants to speak about government and politics, whether as an individual or as an organization, ought to have the same right to do so. And so until we recognize that principle, we're going to have all these problems.
Mm-hmm. Daniel Tokaji, law professor, co-wrote a book, came out this past year, called The New Soft Money. Right. And one of the things, he was interviewing practitioners, basically, candidates, party officials, consultants, outside groups. And one of the things that really struck him was that some of the consultants said, yeah, when I have a candidate that I'm, sort of getting out the gate, I don't take him or her to talk to the state party officials anymore. They're just kind of irrelevant. I take the candidate to talk to the outside groups. And does the atrophy keep going if nothing changes? Do the state parties dwindle away?
I think we're going down that path. And just to kind of continue on the theme of what Peter was saying, there are three things, I think, to answer your last question, unfortunately, that I think we're moving towards. One is a more media-centered campaigns. I think grassroots retail politics is slowly dying. The costs, the bodies, it's all disappearing. That's where the atrophy is going to really be felt, in that there's going to be a lot less grassroots turnout, bodies on the people at the door, people on the phones, and we're going to convert more to a media-based kind of campaign system. And we already are there, but we really need to start thinking about policies to empower parties to get back to that retail politics. And what does that do for you? It does two things. Well, first of all, the next logical step to that is more voter discontent. I mean, these are just kind of self-fulfilling prophecies that will continue to get worse. More polarization, lower turnout. I reread your book this week in preparation for this, and their book could have been written yesterday. Especially the parts about polarization. You talk about polarization in the book, and it's more true today than it was when you wrote it like 5 years ago before Citizens United. And I think what parties bring to the table, and again, I can't say better than this book. This book does a really good job explaining how parties can bring the American political system back to the center. Because right now we're fracturing, and this, I think for better or for worse, we're fracturing because disparate voices are saying disparate things, and we need to come back to the center, and that's what parties do.
Okay. What you just said made me think of the big exception to the shift toward media-centric campaigns and big money, which is the Obama campaigns, where they had this enormous grassroots fundraising operation that funded, in part, an enormous grassroots voter mobilization operation. Is anyone going to be able to replicate that? The party or candidate? Is that a one-time thing or a two-time thing?
Not necessarily. If you can raise the resources to, and remember, if you think about it, the Obama campaign, that was a pretty self-contained program. It was not a program to elect. I mean,
right.
I'm sure I'll get tarred and feathered by my own party for saying something like this, but if you were inside the room for Organizing for America, Obama for America, that was a program to re-elect the president or elect the president. And of course, I'm sure they felt like this was going to trickle down to the rest of the party. But frankly, it was a program to elect one candidate. So can it be replicated? Yes, it can be replicated if you can raise enough money to do it. But what we should really be telling our presidential candidates, our parties, if the parties had the proper infrastructure to support a ticket-wide election, we'd be having much stronger parties. I was at the DNC in the mid-1990s, and it wasn't just Howard Dean that did a great thing with the 50-state strategy, but you can go back to Ron Brown. Ron Brown was the chair back in 1989 through 1993, and to me, he was kind of the father of the building the party infrastructure. He was the one who had a philosophy when I was there to say, if you build it, they will come. It was kind of that philosophy, which is we need to make our party infrastructure strong so that when candidates arrive, they're not reinventing the wheel, they're not bypassing the party, or seeing them as irrelevant. Parties can create their own relevance by being institutionally strong, and they are not institutionally strong. So when the Obama campaign comes along, it's easier for them to justify why they need to create a self-contained get-out-the-vote program, which is about electing. I mean, if you read their materials, they were about not electing Democrats or governors or state legislators. It was about electing Barack Obama. And yes, they're doing the right thing. They are getting boots on the ground. They're making phone calls. But those boots should be talking about the entire ticket, not just one candidate. And not only in those 15 or 20 states where the Electoral College says I need to be there.
Okay, I'll just throw in one thing quickly, which is Robert Much's history of campaign finance reform, the story that he tells of the Democratic Party was ever thus. The top of the ticket rises or falls on its own. The party committee is kind of struggling along behind, and the party as a viable organization is often kind of an iffy thing. That's the picture he paints over the decades. But anyway,
there
Joel.
may be some ways to try to bridge some gaps. And I've seen some proposals since Peter and I wrote the book on Capitol Hill that would try to combine a reduction of the restrictions on parties using their funds to help their candidates with some kind of small donor public financing support or things like that. And that, if something like that were possible, it would enable an increase in small donor support for candidates and parties, while at the same time taking off some of the limits on the party's ability to help their candidates. And it's sort of a rising tide is going to raise all the boats. It may be possible to, if people could kind of get past their talking past each other, to find some basis for compromising with easing some restrictions here and putting in some programs there that would one appeal to one side, one appeal to the other side, and help both sides.
Okay. How would that play out in something like the primary battles that the Republicans went through the past couple cycles, where the Tea Party wing of the party was saying, the deck is stacked, the establishment, controls everything within the party, we're on our own?
Well, it's a good question. I know there have been some concerns expressed over the recent easing of the contribution limits to parties from that perspective. I think primaries are harder. I mean, it's harder to kind of want to come up with a one-size-fits-all rule for funding primaries. So I think the answer is just hard to tell how those play out. I'm not sure I have an answer that kind of gives you the kind of detail you want. But I guess my fallback position is just take the restraints off everybody. I mean, you're going to have disclosure of people that give significant amounts, so you can trace the concerns with influence, but let the different groups and the different parties raise and spend what they think they need to get a message out. That's what we argued in the Buckley case. I think we were right then. I think we're still right. And I'm happy that we're slowly inching toward that approach.
Let me just add something to that, with which I agree. But the problem is that the party, or the fact is that the parties want to elect candidates, and so you talk about the establishment, you talk about the Tea Party. The establishment, quotes, this year tried to make sure that in each district, in each state, the person who was running was electable. And that was noticed in the press and talked about and so forth, and the Tea Party was said to have lost all on every election, and that was the end of the Tea Party, or at least it weakened it substantially. All of that is just talk by the media. The fact is that we are talking, Joel and I, about much stronger parties. You could call them then the establishment. But they would want to find in each district a person who was electable. And so that would either be a person who might otherwise be a Tea Party candidate, like a Rubio, for example, or it would be someone who would be more toward the center. That's the way it ought to work. They are mediating elements, and they try to bring everything together if they can, so that the party, on balance, wins more seats. So this is the sort of thing that reduces the intra-party struggles that we see playing out through all of these different independent groups and who they're supporting. It changes the whole nature of our politics, and that's why it's so important to think about it in those terms.
Wouldn't it just change the incumbent dominance to an internal intra-party fight?
It could, but of course, the controls by the party would be to try to be sure that the incumbents, whoever they are supporting the position of the party. And that's important. What's good for parties now is incumbents because they have so many advantages. But that's not good for the electorate, because the electorate has no real control over what these incumbents do when they are reelected. And so the party tries to change that. The party tries to make sure the incumbents are supporting a party position. And if they won't, then the party is going to look for another candidate.
Okay, we're almost out of time. It's my job as a radio person to hit the post and finish on time. Last words?
Oh, I just wanted to supplement one more thing. It just came to me while Peter was talking, which is there's also a messaging aspect to this as well from a party perspective. Right now in American politics, as I think we could all agree, there's a serious paucity of positive campaign messaging. Is that a fair statement?
You're going out on a limb.
Yeah, right? I see that there's much more prevalence of positive messaging in party communications than there are in candidate messaging and outside group messaging. I think empowering parties will lead to a lot more positive campaign messaging. When parties do mailings, when parties do literature, first of all, it's more substantive. It's more likely to have positive messaging. And I think if we see more parties spending, I think we'll see more positive messaging in campaigns. And I think that will be a huge benefit.
I would just note again, we argued in Buckley that contribution limits not only violated the First Amendment because they inhibited the ability of people and groups to raise the money to get their message out, but that if they were upheld, they just push the money in other places, in less accountable places. Less accountable in terms of transparency, less accountable in terms of governance and responsibility. And sad to say, that's what we've seen for years. And so the efforts to move away from that, I think, are all to be applauded. Peter?
I would just say this, and that is Joel and I brought extra copies of the book. You can probably find it on Amazon. I write a lot about the financial crisis. This is one of the disasters from the financial crisis because it came out in early 2009, and no one wanted to talk about campaign finance at that point. So these books are available to anyone who wants them. You can find them, I think, still on Amazon for 69 cents or something like that, with free shipping. So. But I would recommend that people really consider some of the arguments in this book because they are worth considering in the current situation that we have.
All right. Peter, Joel, Neil, thank you very much.